associated with the tubercle. Then, a little bit more laterally, we're going to see the cuneate tubercle, and so this is going to be the cuneate tubercle here, and coming away from that, this is the fasciculus cuneus, and those are going to be related to general sensory information from the upper limb and the upper half of the trunk. Okay. When we get into the tracts and how sensory information gets up to the brain, this is going to be important to understand where these tubercles are and what information they contain, and the fasciculi as well. Okay. So gracile tubercle and fasciculus, that's going to be related to sensory information from the lower limb and lower half of the trunk. Cuneate tubercle and fasciculus cuneate, those are going to be related to information from the upper limb and upper half of the trunk. Any questions on that? And then we talked about on the ventral side, we have the pyramids. Pyramids contain the corticospinal tract, and then we have the decussation of the pyramids in the medulla, where we see the crossing over of the corticospinal tracts. We also saw that there were a lot of nuclei in this area as well, and related to cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, a little bit of 11, and 12. Cerebellum. Cerebellum is 1/10 of the brain mass, but it contains nearly half of all the neurons found in the brain. So if you think about it, that's a lot of neurons. And what we're going to see is the cerebellum provides timing and patterns of skeletal muscle contractions for smooth and coordinated movements, and also provides error-correcting feedback for movements. And so the way to kind of think about this is it's divided into these two pieces. So we're seeing precise timing and patterns of skeletal muscle contractions. When you walk up a pair of stairs, do you think about, okay, now I have to contract these muscles, now I have to contract these muscles? There's a pattern that gets set down early when we start walking and start going upstairs, that we have a pattern that's automatically set, and that pattern is set in the cerebellum. So obviously, the cerebellum is going to have communications with the primary motor cortex and the frontal lobe to activate certain neurons to say, now you're going to contract, now you're going to contract, so you go up the pair of stairs. And if you think about it, if you go up those stairs and that last set of stairs is a little bit taller, like one of those pairs of stairs is a little bit taller, what do? You trip, because you have this set pattern that you've been doing the whole way up, and you don't think about it, and you trip over those pair of stairs. But that information, the fact that you tripped, goes back to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is going to make that error-correcting feedback, so the next time you go up the stairs, you lift your legs a little bit higher. Lift those lower limbs a little bit higher. So it's going to have that provide that error-correcting feedback for emotions, so that you don't trip when you go up that next step. The way I also think about the cerebellum, if you think about driving a car, if it's a standard, a lot of people, if you drive a stick, you have a basic pattern that you end up having set in your brain for your particular car, but every car is just a little bit different. So if you drive somebody else's car and try to use those same patterns, it doesn't necessarily work, and so you have to have those error-correcting feedback. And so after a little while, you get used to driving somebody else's car. In terms of the anatomy, looking at the cerebellum, we see there's different parts. Just like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has hemispheres associated with it. There's 3 hemispheres. The hemispheres have 3 lobes associated with it. So we have a right hemisphere, a left hemisphere, and each one of those has a lobe. And we see that there's an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe, and a floccular-nodular lobe associated with each one of those hemispheres. We also have a vermis, the arbor vitae, folia, and let's take a look at each one of those as we talk about them. So this is a cartoon representation where the cerebellum has been removed, and so you can see this is going to be more of a superior view looking down on the cerebellum. Here we can see anteriorly, this is going to be our brainstem in that area there. This is going to be a sagittal section, so we can see here's the midbrain, the pons, the medulla here, with the cerebellum hanging off the posterior side. Remember, the cerebellum is coming from the metencephalon, just like the pons does. This is an inferior view, so you're looking up towards the cerebellum from this view here. If you look for the different structures, Again, those that are listed here, you do have two hemispheres, so you have the two hemispheres associated with the cerebellum. Each one of those is going to have different lobes associated with them. The anterior lobes, posterior lobes, and the floccular nodular lobes. The anterior lobes, you can see that here. Posterior lobes, you can see those here. And then to see the floccular nodular lobe, you're actually going to go to an inferior view. These little areas sticking out here, these are the floccular nodular lobes, so you have to see those from an inferior view. Other structures, there's something called the vermis, and you can see the vermis here, as well as here. You can see that it is along the midline. Vermis means worm, like your vermiform appendix. This is the vermis, this means worm. And it's a central connection, it's a central constricted area between this the cerebellar hemisphere. So it's going to be connecting those two cerebellar hemispheres. But somebody looked at it, thought it looked like a worm, and that's where the name comes from, vermis. There's also the arbor vitae and the folia. You can see these in section, and so as you look, the white matter here, the white matter is known as the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. That's where that literally translates as. And so the arbor vitae is a tree-like arrangement of the white matter, and hanging off of that tree is going to be leaves, folia, which is actually the gray matter. So these little folds are the folia. And so folia are the gyri of the cerebellum. And you can see that the gray matter here is going to mean slender parallel ridges. So each one of these is going to be the folia, and that's going to be that gray matter that hangs off the tree of life. So a cartoon representation next to actual dissection, you can look for those different structures again. You can see the anterior lobes, posterior lobes, floccular nodular lobes would be up and underneath. You can see here in an actual dissection, you can see without any type of staining the white matter that makes the arbor vitae, as well as the folia that hangs off of it, those parallel ridges or gyri. See that here as well. And there are also homunculi that are associated with the cerebellum as well, but we're not going to go into those. But just realize there's an obvious organization or pattern associated with the neurons of the cerebellum. The next couple slides are just basically bringing a nice little summary to the slides. You can see the areas of the brain and the major functions. You can see the cerebellar or the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon with its parts. Remember that we also went through basically the organization of the brain based on structure and how it developed. Remember, you can also organize the brain in terms of function. And when you organize the brain based on function, you get things like the limbic system. And so the limbic system, if you hear, that's a functional organization, and so that includes other parts of the brain. So there's parts of the cerebral hemispheres, there's parts of the diencephalon that are included in the limbic system. And that's going to be a very important area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one a little bit later. But the limbic system deals with emotional responses and memory processing. But just keep in mind that you can organize the brain differently, and you can do it based on function. Here we see the brainstem, the three different parts of the brainstem, from superior to inferior. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. There's another functional area called the reticular formation. I won't mention it again. And then the cerebellum. If you didn't like those slides, this does the same thing as well. It takes you through those different areas and talks about the different functions. Does anybody have any questions? So the next lecture takes some information from lesson 25 and 26. We're talking about the ventricles, the meninges, cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood vessels of the brain. These are different objectives and questions to keep in mind. And we're gonna talk about the meninges first. And so when we think about the meninges, these meninges are gonna cover and protect the brain. We're also gonna see that when we talk about the spinal cord, they also cover and protect the spinal cord as well. And these meninges are going to protect and support blood vessels, enclose what are called dural venous sinuses, and we'll talk about what those are in a second. A lot of these are going to contain cerebral spinal fluid. We'll talk about where we see that CSF. And we also see that parts of the meninges are going to help partition the skull, and so create different rooms within this large cavity known as the cranial cavity. So we're going to look at the meninges, and so these are 3 connective tissue layers. So this is all connective tissue. We have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. This is the order of them from superficial to deep. So in this dissection, what they've done here is that you can see this is going to be the bone. They've gone a little bit below that, and this is then going to be the dura mater. You can see then the arachnoid mater, and then that shiny appearance you see on the surface of the gyri, this is going to be the pia mater. So dura mater, arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater on the surface of the brain, from superficial to deep. So we're going to talk about each one of these, and the first is the dura mater. This is the most superficial of the 3. Literally translates as tough mother. Very tough, strongest of the meninges. It's opaque, as we saw in the image before. It's fibrous connective tissue, very dense fibrous connective tissue. And when we look at it in the cranium, so within the skull, there's 2 layers to it. The more superficial layer is the perosteal layer. And if you remember, the perosteum is that connective tissue covering on bone. So if you go on the underside of the skull, you have the perosteum. That perosteum is actually part of the dura mater as well. Then deep to that, you have the meningeal layer. And this is going to be continuous with the dura mater that's going to be found in the spinal cord. So you have 2 layers, you have the perosteal layer and you have the meningeal layer. So as we look, here we see the skin of the scalp, here's the perosteum on the outer surface of our flat bone of the skull. Here's our bone of the flat bone of the skull, compact bone, dipole in the middle. Then we have the perosteum on the inner side, and that perosteum is the first layer of the dura mater. Well, that dura mater also has a second layer below it, and this is going to be the meningeal layer here. So these 2 layers here make up the dura mater. So these 2 layers here make up the dura mater. Yep.
Okay, so you said the meningeal layer of the dura mater is the only meningeal layer
It's going to
in
continue,
the vertebral column?
It's going to continue into the vertebral column. So actually when you go and look at the spinal cord and look at the dura mater that surrounds the spinal cord, there's no perosteal layer that is associated or considered part of the dura mater. There's still perosteum with the vertebrae, but the difference is that the dura mater in the vertebral column is not up against the bone. And so since it's not up against the bone, it doesn't include the perosteal layer, it's only the meningeal layer.
Gotcha. But we don't see the arachnoid or pia mater?
We will see those.
Okay.
Yeah, so but of the dura mater, of the dura mater itself, there's only the meningeal layer that's going to continue into the vertebral column.
Gotcha. So the periosteal layer is the outlier. Okay.
Yeah. So the way to think of it is you only can utilize the perosteum in the skull, not in the vertebral column, to make part of the meninges, part of the dura mater.
Okay, thanks.
Now here's the interesting part. The dura mater does a lot more than just protect the brain. It goes back to those other sort of categories of structures and functions, and really is going to be important in number 2 with enclosing dural venous sinuses and partitioning the skull. And that is through what are called the dural venous sinuses and dural septa. And so when you look at the dura mater, it has those 2 layers. But sometimes those 2 layers split from each other. So the perosteal layer and the meningeal layer split. And when they split, you actually can start to get blood in those areas, and it's going to collect blood coming back from the brain. So they're acting as veins of the brain. So when you hear the term dural venous sinuses, these sinuses are not part of the paranasal sinuses, which are air-filled. These dural venous sinuses are gaps in the dura mater that contain blood. So there's blood coming back from the brain. So the dural venous sinuses are gaps in the dura mater where venous blood collects. And actually, if you take a look at it histologically, they're actually lined by endothelial cells. Histology. Okay, so there are small veins associated with the brain, and the small veins are actually going to open up into these dural venous sinuses. You have the superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, a straight sinus, an occipital sinus, a transverse sinus, a sigmoid sinus, superior petrosal sinus, inferior petrosal sinus, and cavernous sinus. Yep.
One more.
Go ahead.
Are these involved in meningitis, or is that actual swelling of the actual layers?
No, meninges, if you have meningitis will be part of the, or a disease associated with the meninges. So it would be associated with the dura mater, which is making up these dural venous sinuses.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a look at each one of these. So where would these be located? So we're going to start first with the superior sagittal sinus. You have one and only one superior sagittal sinus, and it lies in the median plane. So it lies right along the median plane, along the superior border of the falx cerebri. This is called the falx cerebri. Let's go through, I'm going to back up and go through the things below there first, so it'll make a little bit more sense. Besides the dural venous sinuses, we also have where the parosteal layer pulls away from the meningeal layer, or the meningeal layer pulls away from the parosteal layer to form walls within the cranial cavity. And this is to support the brain. So if you think about the brain, it's floating within your skull, and you don't want it moving too far one direction or the other direction. You also want it to be supported underneath. And so we see that meningeal layer pull away from the parosteal layer to create these folds of dura mater that create different septa or walls within the cranial cavity to really support the brain. So these dural septa will limit extensive movement of the brain within the cranium. The first is the falx cerebri, and I mentioned that a second ago. This is the falx cerebri right here. So this is the meningeal layer that's pulled away from the parosteal layer, and it's going to sit along the median plane. It sits or dips within the longitudinal fissure. So it's sitting between two cerebral hemispheres. So it's keeping the brain from moving too far to the right or to the left. So it's sitting between the cerebral hemispheres along the sagittal plane. It's the largest of the dural septa. Remember the crista galli, part of the, anybody remember what bone?
Sphenoid?
Ethmoid, good. This falx cerebri attaches anteriorly to the crista galli, and that's the importance of the crista galli. It gives a anterior anchoring point for that falx cerebri. Well, you have this falx cerebri that's sitting between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. We also have a septa that is going to sit between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, and that's going to be the falx cerebelli. The falx cerebelli separates the two cerebellar hemispheres. You then have the tentorum cerebelli. Tentorum cerebelli is going to be the second largest dural septa. It sits within the transverse fissure between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum, and that's this right here. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of brain back here, and there's a lot of weight associated with it. The brain weighs about 3 pounds on an average adult. And so if you think about it, there's a lot of structures that are right underneath the brain, and you want to support some of the weight of the brain even though it's floating. And so this transverse cerebral fissure is sitting, or the transverse the tentorum cerebelli is sitting in that transverse fissure and really holding those occipital lobes from really crushing the underlying cerebellum. And the last one is the sellar diaphragm. This is going to be the smallest of these folds. You can see this right here. And this is actually going to have a little hole in the middle of it, and it's really forming the roof over the hypophyseal fossa. And so it has to have a hole in the middle of it for the infundibulum from that hypothalamic stalk to be able to come through and connect to the pituitary gland. So when you get a pituitary gland tumor, that tumor can't grow inferiorly, anteriorly, posteriorly, laterally because of the bone of the sella turcica. It can only grow superiorly and push through that sellar diaphragm. And then we'll talk a little bit later about what it's going to impact. So this just goes ahead and shows you all those different gives you more opportunities to locate and find the different septa. Here's the falx cerebri here, the falx cerebelli here, the tentorium cerebelli here, and the sellar diaphragm would be right in this area here. And you can see those different ones here, as well as here. Okay. So if we go back and start adding in the dural venous sinuses, these are gaps within that dura mater. We're going to see that the first one was the superior sagittal sinus. The sagittal is telling you it's along the midline, and the superior portion is the fact that it lies along the superior border of the falx cerebri. So here's our falx cerebri. We're going to go right along the superior border, right along here. This is the superior sagittal sinus. And the blood in the superior sagittal sinus is heading posteriorly to this area right here, which is called the confluence of the sinuses. If you ever hear a confluence of a river, it's where different streams come together into a particular area. And so this is the confluence of the sinuses, because there's going to be a number of different sinuses that come back into that area. The superior sagittal sinus is also important because dipping into the superior sagittal sinus are going to be things called the arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi. That's part of the arachnoid mater, and those arachnoid granulations are going to allow for the reabsorption of cerebral spinal fluid into the superior sagittal sinus. So a lot of your CSF, you constantly produce it, you got to get rid of it somewhere, and so it's going to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream at the superior sagittal sinus. Yeah?
So when they're putting shunts in, when they put shunts in kids, is that the layer that the shunt actually?
The shunt actually goes into where we see the CSF, and the CSF is going to be in the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. The next one on the list is the inferior sagittal sinus. The name's telling you a lot about where it's located. Sagittal, so it's along the midline, and it's found inferiorly. In the inferior sagittal sinus, you only have one of these, and it's along 2/3 of the posterior, the inferior border of the falx cerebri. So here's your falx cerebri, and you go down here, starting about right in this area here, about 2/3 of the inferior border of the falx cerebri. That's your inferior sagittal sinus, and it's going to end right in this area here. Okay. The next one is the straight sinus. You only have one straight sinus. It's formed by the great cerebral vein and the inferior sagittal sinus coming together. So here's your inferior sagittal sinus. Here's your great cerebral vein. The two come together and they form the straight sinus. The straight sinus goes right along where the falx cerebri comes into the tentorium cerebelli and heads right back to that confluence of the sinuses right in this area here. So now you have two sinuses coming into that confluence of the sinus. You have the straight sinus and you have the superior sagittal sinus coming into that confluence of the sinus area. Next is the occipital sinus. That's a rather small one. The occipital sinus is going to be the third. It's going to be right along here. They don't even label it. It's very small. But it's going to be the third of the sinuses that are coming into the confluence of the sinuses. And it's the occipital sinus because it's related to the occipital bone. So coming into the confluence of the sinuses, you have three sinuses. You have the occipital sinus, the straight sinus, and the superior sagittal sinus. Well, if you have all this blood flowing into this point, which is near that external occipital protuberance around this area right here, if you have all that blood flowing in there, you need to get away from that area. And that brings up the idea of the transverse sinus. And you actually have two of these. They're called the transverse sinuses. There's one on the right, one on the left. The transverse sinuses are going to drain the confluence of the sinuses. So coming out towards you and going away from you is going to be the transverse sinuses. They're along the posterior border of the tentorium cerebelli. See if you can find a better picture. So here's your confluence of the sinuses right here. You have your straight sinus, your occipital sinus, and your superior sinus coming into this confluence, and coming out towards you and then going away from you are these transverse sinuses. So they're draining that confluence area. You then have the sigmoid sinus. You have two of these. They follow an S-shaped course in the posterior cranial fossa. So where you see that transverse sinus start turning and start taking on this S-shaped pattern associated with it, this is the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus is going to enter the internal, or is going to enter into the jugular vein, is going to enter into the jugular foramen, and when it enters into the jugular foramen, it becomes the internal jugular vein. So your sigmoid sinus is going to enter into the jugular foramen, and in there it becomes the internal jugular vein. A few others to mention: superior petrosal sinus, so these have these, and the inferior petrosal sinuses. These obviously, if you see petrosal, that's talking about that petrous portion of the temporal bone, that real hard portion of the temporal bone. That's where they're located. And then the cavernous sinus. Let's talk about the cavernous sinus first. The cavernous sinuses, there are two of them. They're very large sinuses that are located on either side of the sella turcica. So your sella turcica sitting here. On one side and the opposite side is this grouping of sinuses, and that's called the cavernous sinuses. The cavernous sinuses then are going to be drained by the superior petrosal sinus and the inferior petrosal sinus. That superior petrosal sinus comes over right where the transverse sinus turns and becomes the sigmoid sinus, and that inferior petrosal dumps into the sigmoid sinus right before it goes into the jugular foramen. Yeah.
Can you repeat where the superior and inferior drain into?
Okay, the superior petrosal. So right here is, you see your transverse sinus, and all of a sudden it turns, and now it's the sigmoid sinus. Right where it turns, that's where that petrosal, the superior petrosal sinus is going to drain into it. The inferior petrosal is going to drain into the sigmoid sinus just as it enters into the jugular foramen. So let's look at a short video that kind of brings all this information together.
Venous blood from the brain drains into a system of valveless channels called dural venous sinuses. These sinuses are located at the margins of dural folds where the periosteal and meningeal layers of dura mater separate. Along the midline, two sinuses that receive venous blood from the brain and meninges are the superior sagittal sinus and inferior sagittal sinus. These lie in the superior and inferior margins of the dural fold, known as falx cerebri. Blood in the superior sagittal sinus flows posteriorly to the confluence of sinuses. Here it unites with the straight sinus and occipital sinus. The straight sinus is formed by the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein. The paired transverse sinuses extend laterally from the confluence of sinuses and run horizontally along the internal margin of the occipital bone. The transverse sinuses continue as the S-shaped sigmoid sinuses. The sigmoid sinuses enter their respective jugular foramina to become the internal jugular veins of the neck.
So basically these are veins to allow for the drainage of the blood from the brain, away from the brain.
The next video started.
Hi, engineers. In this video, we're going to talk about the veins that are going to be draining the structures of the head and the neck.
No, we won't.
Okay?
So the next couple slides just give you more opportunity to find these different dural venous sinuses and different septas associated with it. Here you can see the confluence of the sinus back here. And the way I kind of think of the confluence of sinuses and kind of remember things is 3 in, 2 out. 3 venous sinuses are gonna drain into it, 2 are gonna drain away from it. So the 3 that are coming in are gonna be the superior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, and they don't show it here, but the occipital sinus. 2 away would be the 2 transfer sinuses that drain away from that particular area. And here, this is a posterior dissection. Here you can see the posterior cranial fossa, which contains the cerebellum. Here you can see the foramen magnum, and here you can see the medulla connected to the spinal cord. And this opaque tissue that you see here, this is going to be the dura mater. We have left the dura mater on one side, removed it on the other side. You can see the beginning of the cerebral hemispheres here, and this would be the occipital lobe. So you know in the longitudinal fissure, that would be your falx cerebri. Sitting in the transverse fissure here would be the tentorium cerebelli. And along the edges of those different folds are going to be different sinuses. So along the superior edge of the falx cerebri, there's your superior sagittal sinus here. And along the posterior edge of the tentorium cerebelli, here are your transverse sinuses. So your confluence of the sinuses would be right in this area here. Coming in would be 3 different sinuses, your superior sagittal sinus, your straight sinus, which is coming out here, and the occipital sinus, which should be in about this area here. And then coming away would be the 2 transverse sinuses in that direction. So this is a venogram of the sinuses, and so you can look for different structures based on where you would think they would be located. So we know the confluence of the sinuses are going to be right in this area here near the occipital, external occipital protuberance. And so this is a posterior portion of the head, this is anterior, this is a sagittal or lateral view, and this is anterior posterior view. And so the confluence of the sinuses would be in this area here, and draining away from there would be the transverse sinuses. Confluence of the sinus, transverse sinus. But when that transverse sinus starts heading south, it's going to be the sigmoid sinus. So when it starts heading inferiorly, that's going to be your sigmoid sinus. And that sigmoid sinus is heading towards the, right here, that's going to be your jugular foramen. And once it goes into that jugular foramen, it becomes the internal jugular vein. Any questions on that? Okay, let's go a little bit deeper now. Let's talk about the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid mater in this image is going to be this purple. And you can see the arachnoid mater is going to be where the name is coming from. It's a very loose brain covering, kind of looks like a spider web over the surface of the brain. It has little web-like extensions that connect it to the underlying pia mater. So there's these little web-like extensions. They come down and connect it to the pia mater. We're going to see that the dura mater and the dura mater and the arachnoid mater do not dip down into sulci. So here you can see, here's the sulcus here, here's the sulcus here. You can see the dura mater does not dip down into the sulci. The arachnoid mater does not dip down into the sulci. The only meninge that actually dips down into the sulci is going to be the pia mater. You can see that there are extensions of, and I've mentioned this before, extensions of the arachnoid mater, and specifically right here, this is going to be your superior sagittal sinus, and there's extensions of the arachnoid mater into the superior sagittal sinus. These extensions are called arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi, and this is how cerebrospinal fluid can be reabsorbed into the venous system, because deep to the arachnoid mater is called the subarachnoid space. And that subarachnoid space is an actual space that contains cerebrospinal fluid. So CSF is between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. And so that arachnoid mater, that the CSF can get up into the arachnoid granulations and then be reabsorbed into the bloodstream to the superior sagittal sinus. We then have the pia mater. The pia mater is very thin, gives the brain a very shiny appearance as it adheres to the surface and follows all along its contours. You can't really dissect it off the brain. So pia mater, you can't really dissect it off the brain, and it's a very loose connective tissue. And you can see it in the blue here, dipping into all of the grooves and so forth.
question?
Yep.
Since the pia mater is the only layer that is touching and covering or going into the sulci, does it do any exchange with brain structures, or does it have any significance with what it's doing with brain structures?
It's not gonna have any exchange, it's actually creating a barrier between, and it's very selective about what can come across here. We're also gonna see that the pia mater is also gonna be involved or related to some of the blood vessels as well, and will be useful in creating cerebrospinal fluid. We'll see that in a couple minutes. So related to the meninges are different spaces. And some spaces are actual spaces, meaning they're there all the time, and some spaces are clinical spaces or potential spaces that are only there in pathological issues or situations. So the first space that we want to talk about is going to be the epidural space. The epidural space is between the perosteal layer of the dura mater and the bone. So normally, if we go back and look, this is a potential space, because normally what we're seeing is here's our dura mater, and that dura mater is right up against the bone. So the space would technically be this space here, but that perosteum needs to be right up against that bone to do its job. And so that is a potential space. So epidural space is going to be superficial to the dura mater. It's a potential space, meaning it's not normally there. It's only found pathologically. Blood can collect there from things like a torn middle meningeal artery. We talked about the middle meningeal artery. Does anybody remember what foramen that goes through?
You told us.
Associated with the greater wing of the sphenoid. There's 3 holes.
Foramen ovalid
Spinosum.
spinosum.
Foramen spinosum. So it comes through the foramen spinosum, and then it's going to travel, between the dura mater and the bone of the skull. And if you get a blow to the head, you can actually tear that middle meningeal artery, and so that artery is going to start leaking blood, and that blood starts collecting in that epidural space, and so you end up with a hemorrhage or a hematoma at the location. And so skull fractures can lead to this arterial hemorrhage in this location. Now the problem is that your brain, you'll notice when we look at the removal of the brain is going to take up all the space in the cranium. And so there's not a lot of give. And so if we start collecting blood here, it's going to start compressing on the brain tissue. And so compression of the brain increases as blood mass increases, and so that's got to be fixed typically. The next space is the subdural space. That's going to be deep to the dura mater. It's between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. So it's between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. That's also a potential space. So normally, if you go back to what we saw in the image before, our arachnoid mater is right up against the dura mater. Normally those two should be right like this. And that's because of the underlying cerebrospinal fluid pressure that's keeping those two attached and related to one another. But blows to the head can cause what's called a subdural hemorrhage or hematoma. There's typically going to be venous in origin, and it usually results from the tearing of the cerebral vein where it enters the superior sagittal sinus. So here's the cerebral vein where it's going to the superior sagittal sinus. Say you have a blow to the head or some sort of trauma, and that actually can rip that entry point, and you can get blood between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. And so normally it's a potential space. It's not normally there, but if blood starts collecting there, it's going to separate those two. The last space is the subdural space, or subarachnoid space. It's the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So here we have our arachnoid mater. Here we have our pia mater.